I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a movie recently released onto Netflix that has caused quite a controversy. While most professional critics were generally favourable, audiences seem to be split down the middle, with some believing it to be an artistic masterpiece and others thinking it was a boring waste of time. So having now seen it, what are my thoughts? Well, honestly, I can kind of see both sides of the argument. I personally loved the first half of the movie. It was able to draw me into the mystery, and the film built such an uncomfortably eerie atmosphere that I was genuinely intrigued as to where it was all going. Unfortunately, the second half of the movie kind of lost me because it gradually became clear that the mystery wasn't really going to receive much of a payoff. Honestly, my views on this movie feel so mixed that I'm not really sure if I liked or hated it as a whole. But if there's one thing I can say for certain, it's that it does give me a lot to analyse in terms of what it's trying to say. So today, instead of just reviewing the movie, I'd like to examine it and ask the simple question, what's it really about? The film begins with a young woman going on a road trip with her boyfriend Jake to meet his parents. Though it may not be noticeable at first, there is something kind of off about this woman. The details of her life, including her own name, keep changing throughout the movie. One minute her name is Lucy and she's a poet, and then the next it's Louisa and she's a physics student. While her real name is never made clear, since most of them are variations of Lucy, then to make things easier, that's what I'm going to be calling her for the rest of the video. Lucy is, as the title suggests, thinking of ending things. She's only been dating Jake for a short time, and it's clear she isn't entirely on board with the relationship, despite seeing some of the positives. If there's one theme that seems to be consistent throughout this movie, it's uncertainty. Aside from the aforementioned details about Lucy's life constantly shifting, there's the fact that she can't remember certain details, like how long she's been dating Jake or how they really met. This theme of uncertainty will continue and become drastically apparent later on. Lucy and Jake arrive at Jake's old family home, and Jake decides to show her around. He takes her into a barn where the sheep are being kept, all huddled together for warmth. There are a couple of dead sheep lying outside the pen that have succumbed to the cold, but are being ignored and left as they are. Jake then mentions that they once had pigs too, and tells a rather gruesome story about how his father once stopped paying attention to them for a few days, and this resulted in him not realising that they'd developed maggot-infested sores. There's a fair bit of symbolism in this scene, as it shows that the sheep who stick together have managed to survive the harsh cold by relying on one another, but those outside have frozen to death without the warmth of others. And the story of the pigs carries the message about how those who are ignored and have no one to rely on can suffer in silence, and any wounds they may be dealing with will fester without help. In other words, this scene effectively shows us the main theme and message of this movie, that being the consequences of isolation. Lucy meets Jake's parents who've made dinner for her, and this is, in my opinion, the best scene in the movie. I'll always say the most effective form of horror is that which is relatable, and meeting a partner's parents for the first time is an anxiety-inducing situation even for the best of us. So turning it into a psychological horror situation is a pretty good idea. Throughout the meal, everything is just so incredibly off. The tension is constant. Something is wrong, but it's so unclear what. Why is Jake so angry? Why is the mother acting so weird? Is Lucy ever going to be able to leave, as she keeps mentioning she wants to? And of course, why do all the details of Lucy's life keep changing? The theme of uncertainty continues as the story seems to break down. The parents' ages begin to fluctuate. The situation flips back and forth as one moment they're at dinner and the next Jake is consoling his dying mother. Lucy explores the home and the constantly shifting details begin to appear in the background, such as a poem she previously claimed to have been working on appearing in a book of poetry in the house, clearly having been written by someone else. The whole scenario feels almost like it's turning into a half-remembered nightmare. Things don't make sense, things are constantly shifting, yet it's presented as normal and isn't questioned. Lucy keeps asking Jake if they can leave because the snow is turning into a full-on blizzard, and every time Jake insists they'll be fine because he can just put chains on the tires. And eventually they do leave. This took me by surprise as I thought Lucy was just going to be trapped in the house for the entire movie. She and Jake continue to talk in the car and eventually stop by an ice cream parlour where they have a strange encounter with the women serving them, one of whom seems to be hiding something, which Lucy notices but Jake doesn't. Then, eventually, they arrive at a high school. Jake disappears and Lucy tries to follow him, but eventually runs into an old janitor. The janitor has been randomly appearing throughout the movie, and scenes will often cut to him, usually just going about his life in a mundane fashion. Lucy asks him if he's seen Jake, so he asks her to describe him, and Lucy describes him as just a man she met at a bar who creeped her out a little and that nothing happened between them. While nothing is outright stated, the truth behind the whole situation is becoming more and more apparent. And that truth is that Lucy isn't real, and neither is the story. It's why everything is so inconsistent. It's why it constantly flips back and forth like some kind of weird dream. The janitor is the real protagonist of this story. It's likely that he himself is the real Jake. He's a lonely old man who's been living a fantasy in order to cope. A fantasy that revolves around witnessing and likely envying younger students, some of which look exactly like the girls at the ice cream parlour. We see Lucy re-encounter Jake, only now the two of them are much younger, and they pull off a fantastical dance number. As it seems their dance is about to have a happy ending, all of a sudden a dancer representing the old janitor appears and seals Lucy away, and fighting with young Jake before killing him with a knife. If they are indeed the same person, it's a fairly clear way of confirming that the idealized young version of Jake is gone and has been replaced by a lonely old man past his prime. The real janitor begins to hallucinate and sees a cartoon version of the pig infested with maggots. The pig leads him through the school to a stage where he, as Jake, gives a final musical performance. Despite wanting to be famous and loved, it's quite clear that in truth, the janitor is just like the pig. He's alone and in pain. He feels like society has abandoned him just as the father abandoned the pig, and as a result, the sickness and pain he's been dealing with is only getting worse because he feels there's no one to help him out of it. All he can do to cope with it is imagine scenarios where things went well and he found someone to love and to be with. Except now the fantasy is changing. Throughout the story, Lucy always imagines the words "I'm thinking of ending things," but those words aren't really referring to her relationship. Lucy was likely once the janitor's ideal woman, a perfect girl who shares all his interests and makes him and his family happy, just like the woman in the happy romance film he watches earlier on in the movie. But now, as his isolation grows and the pain of loneliness becomes too much, Lucy is becoming the voice in his head that's telling him to end things, except she means that in a much darker fashion. She's beginning to represent his complete dissatisfaction with life. She's beginning to represent his desire to get away from it all. Jake, on the other hand, is trying to cling to normality. He sees things in a positive light. He's repeatedly trying to deny or hold back the problems. He insists that his solutions, like the chains on the tires, will fix things no matter the storm. And whenever Lucy thinks the words "I'm thinking of ending things," he always notably interrupts her. What began as a harmless fantasy of what life could have been like for the janitor has now become a struggle with his psyche. One part of him just wants to end things. The other wants to act like everything's okay and to find solutions and work through it all. The latter resembles the younger, idealized version of the janitor, and the former resembles a woman at a bar who rejected him once and considers him a creepy loser. Even though the janitor accepts that he and the pig ultimately are the same, his last fantasy of Jake winning a Nobel Prize and giving a musical performance without Lucy possibly suggests that maybe Jake's idealism was able to win out in the end. that despite the nightmare of isolation, the janitor will continue on. Is this a happy ending? Well, not really. There's nothing to suggest the janitor's life is going to change. He's clinging to his last days, but he's still woefully unhappy. Though it's ambiguous, his car engine starting over the end credits suggests that, unlike in the books, he does possibly survive the ordeal, but it's likely he will still die alone and trapped in a fantasy, not getting the help he needs. In this sense, he's more like the abandoned sheep, slowly freezing to death because they don't have the support and the warmth of others. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is ultimately a movie about the horrors of loneliness and isolation. Humans are naturally social animals, and being abandoned and ignored by everyone around us can eat away at us and turn us cold, just like the abandoned animals. And without the support of friends or family, the pain will only fester and get worse. Is it a perfect movie? No. As I've said, there's a lot of build-up with not much payoff, and it starts out with the promises of being a psychological horror, but it effectively turns into an existential horror by the end. And yeah, not everyone is going to be satisfied with that. That said, there's no denying that right now, messages about loneliness and isolation are pretty relevant. Right now, everything that's going on in the world can feel like the raging blizzard, and it's easy to feel like one of the sheep in the pen, with some of us sticking together and surviving with each other's help, and others, sadly, feeling more weak and alone than ever. And at times like these, sometimes the best way to cope is indeed through the medium of art and fantasy. Thanks for watching the video. I was originally considering reviewing this straight up, but I've been thinking of moving more towards video essay and analytical type stuff in the future, and I thought this would make for such a video. Have you seen the movie? And if so, did you like it? Did you hate it? Or were you like me and couldn't quite make your mind up either way? Whatever your thoughts, let me know down below. Like, share and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye!